Hello everybody, distinguished guests. It's a pleasure for me to be here talking about Middle East in this distinguished school. Actually, President Clinton was a very beloved president in Turkey. I remember when I was a graduate school student in late 90s. So it's also another reason of being happy to speak in the school which is affiliated by his name. Today, I'm going to focus on Middle East. I have a kind of grand title, what's going on in Middle East. It's very difficult because so many dynamics that await us to cover, to explain any aspect of the region. Mainly, I'm going to focus first the general dynamics that determine what's happening in terms of states, sub-state actors. When I say sub-state actors, I refer ISIS-like terrorist organizations, the sociological dynamics, and in the later part of my speech, I'm going to focus on groups dynamics, which is also linked to these macro sociological facts. Before these points, I want to emphasize that I had the opportunity of being in these countries in the last 6 years. I've been to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. I live in Syria during the last summer before the Arab Spring 2010 at Damascus University, Lebanon, Israel. So I had the opportunity of observing the facts at daily level in different areas from Afghanistan, from Pakistan to other countries. In political science, there are many distinguished colleagues here. We all know that before analyzing something, we first ask the question what we have in front of us. What is this? Because we call it Arab Spring. Of course, it's a misnomer. It's not a spring. After 3 years, what we have is an almost collapsed region. So it shouldn't be named with a spring. But from the perspective of political science, what is that? What is the correct term to begin analyzing all these events that we have had in the last 3 years? Of course, it depends on your perspective, scholarly perspective. Some may offer different perspectives, but my scholarly perspective, I think when we look at what we have in the region, we may call it revolutionary process from the very beginning. So the idea of revolution, using it as it's being used in political science, may help us to understand what we have, why we have ISIS-like organizations. They are all linked each other. But in political theory, revolution is a fancy word. We like the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, American Revolution. But there's a problem about revolutions. They are a very dangerous process because a revolution may end up in very different dramatic ways. Because a revolution means that people start to change a regime, destroying their governments. You are all familiar with the motto, Tahrir Square, thousands of Arabs, Al-Sha'ab yurid al-Isqat al-Nizam, which means that people want to dismiss the regime. So revolution naturally aims to dismiss the regime. So there is one practical lesson from revolutionary process. You should replace the regime in a reasonable time. If you start a revolutionary process, if you fail, and if you fail to change it in a reasonable time, you end up in a very dramatic outcomes. For example, state collapse, as it happened in Libya. As far as I know, the interim prime minister of Libya was hijacked more than 2 times in the last year, which means there is no state order in Libya. There is almost no state order in Yemen right now. No need to talk about Syria, it's a state collapse. Or how about Iraq, it's a state collapse as well. So the first point about revolutionary process, in the beginning we all salute the Arab Spring as a revolutionary process in Arab countries bringing democracy, but as I said, history is full of failed revolutions which end up as chaotic situations, mainly state collapse. So the first point I want to emphasize is one of the biggest legacies so far of the Arab Spring is the state collapses all over the region. Please imagine the Middle East map right now. If you know where Turkey is, on the northern part of Turkey, we have neighboring country, other side of Black Sea, Ukraine. Ukraine is a state, is going through a state collapse right now. How about Georgia? It's divided. Some of Georgia, are occupied by some other groups which do not accept the Tbilisi's sovereignty, supported by some other countries, including Russia. What about Iraq? It's a state collapse. What about Syria? Another state collapse. Libya is a state collapse. Egypt is the only way. I mean, there is no Iraqi-like state collapse in Egypt, but let me give you a number. The Egyptian population is almost equal to Turkey's population, but the Egyptian economy is only 1/3 of Turkish economy, which means that it is on the brink, very close to state collapse. Things could be dramatically changed. That is why the Egyptian government cannot rule a large part of its territory, Sinai Peninsula. So the first point is state collapse. The second is why it is difficult to analyze Arab Spring-related events. We are observing many ground events of political science in a very short time. Revolutions happen very rarely. Wars happen very rarely in some history of some societies. But in Middle East, we have, just focus on Egypt, for example. In the beginning, there was a revolution against Mubarak regime. Then there was the Tantawi, General Tantawi, takeover. Then it was the counter-revolution. In Egypt, some say it's a counter-revolution, some say it's a coup d'etat. Then we have the coup d'etat. Look at this picture. In a country, because of revolutionary process and in a very negative way, we have coups, revolutions, counter-coups, military takeovers, and counter-revolutions. So the difficulty of the region is we are observing so many big events in a very, very short period. Or Syria, there is a state collapse, and also there is a civil war. This is interesting to make it from a comparative perspective. In the beginning of Arab Spring, I read an article written by Bani Sadr. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this name. Bani Sadr was the first president after Khomeini revolution in Iran. And in an interesting article, he said that, oh, revolutionary guys, I know you are, you have, this euphoria of realizing a revolution in your country. You are excited, but there are many revolutions that were hijacked in the history. Another dramatic outcome is your revolution could be hijacked. And it is interesting to read it from Bani Sadr because, the Iranian revolution took place with the cooperation of Islamists, Marxist Tudeh party, liberals, socialists, but it ended up as a Khomeinian brand of Islamism. It was hijacked according to Bani Sadr. So Bani Sadr's warning to Arab revolutionaries were very meaningful. And I think in Egypt, the revolution was hijacked, then it was hijacked by others, and that revolution was hijacked by others. So, in brief, as a general picture, there are some major outcomes to our Arab Spring so far. The one is to repeat state collapse. So while analyzing why we have subgroups like ISIS, why we have, transaction through different countries, we should keep that state collapse is a main fact. Let me elaborate this from a different perspective. State collapse creates two dramatic outcomes. One is, it kills citizenship. Imagine you are living in Syria, in a collapsed society. There is no state institutions, which means that citizenship and citizenship-linked institutions cannot protect you. The only way to survive is to go back your ethnic identity or sectarian identity. It is happening in the same way in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Libya, and in Yemen. Because of state collapse, citizenship falls into a kind of crisis, along with its institutions. Then the only way to survive for people in the region is to return their sectarian, tribal, or group identities. This is extremely important to analyze why different groups are emerging, because it is the time for sectarian identities. It is the time for ethnic and tribal identities. When I was in northern Afghanistan, part of a project in northern Afghanistan, Mazar-e-Sharif, I had an interview with some local people. And I asked them, what do you think about Mr. Karzai? Is he a successful president? There was a lady who responded to, I have no idea who is that. They didn't even know his name, because there were no state institutions to bring the news, to bring his activities, if he's successful or not. Imagine Afghanistan has been part of an instability and war for more than 50 years. There is a generation, a product of an order or disorder without any state institutions. Then there was a local councilman who told me, Professor, I know Karzai. He's the governor of Kabul, he said to me. That's the point. Talabani is now the former president of Iraq, was a governor of Baghdad. So, I mean, this means that state collapse, because of the state collapse, people, the only alternative for people to protect their families, to protect their properties through tribal networks. The second is, again, which is very critical to analyze sub-state actors' dynamics, state collapse kills socialization cycle. What is socialization cycle? You become an Iraqi, you born in Iraq, happen to born in Iraq, you go to a school, okay, you socialize in a neighborhood, you watch your president at TV, you support your national football team in international competitions, but there is, I mean, what we have in Iraq, in the last 2 decades, we have a generation which came out from a very chaotic situation, lacking all this stuff. Now imagine a Syrian girl who was forced to leave Syria with her family and start to live in a camp in Turkey. For example, she's 8 years old. Now it's been 3 years since the beginning. She's 11 years old right now. Most probably she's going to stay in Turkey out of socialization cycle of being Syrian in another 5 years. Then who is she after 5 years? She is no longer a Syrian. She is no longer a Turkish. She is no longer a that. So this creates thousands of individuals raised out of their socialization cycle with deep traumas, with deep family problems, which is critical to understand the emergence of sub-state actors again. We are having all these facts in the region. For example, there are more than 3 million Syrian refugees in different countries in the Middle East. 3 million means that you can no longer explain that by using the term refugee. It's a kind of exodus, mass exodus of people. Most probably, most of these people will never return to Syria. No one can guarantee that there will be a solution to deep Syrian problems in the upcoming 5 years. So the only solution for them is to socialize in different areas. I had the opportunity of visiting some camps in Turkey. Only some of the Syrians are living in camps. You cannot keep them in a camp. They are millions of people. They are part of our society. They are socialized with us, which means that they are becoming different stereotypes from sociological perspective out of their socialization cycle. This is extremely important because we have many states from Pakistan, for example, South Waziristan. There's a state collapse over there. A large part of South Waziristan cannot be controlled by a central Pakistani government. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, so all these state collapses create a generation out of their socialization cycle. These 3 points are enormously important to understand why we have these groups. Why we have these groups? Because people facing the collapse of institutions and mechanisms, this is very normal that they are going to seek shelter from their ethnic and sectarian and other mechanisms. So this is the major dynamic of the Arab Spring. Is there a lesson to us? Yes. I think beyond this debate, a major lesson of the whole Arab Spring is do not destabilize a country if you don't have alternative. If you don't have the capacity to replace that one, don't change it. I'm not in a position to talk in favor of Gaddafi, the former Libyan dictator, but I was in a conference in Prague, and there were some young Arabs criticizing harshly Gaddafi era. And there was suddenly, there was also, interestingly, the former Egyptian ambassador to Libya, who raised his hand and said that, oh, young gentlemen, you have no idea about Gaddafi. Of course, Gaddafi was authoritarian, but there is a simple lesson to us here. If you are not able to change, make a regime change in a country, you shouldn't destabilize that region because it turns to be a kind of state collapse, citizenship collapse, and the emergence of so many groups in this area. That is why, even right now, the last thing we may accept, again, Mr. Assad is authoritarian, but destabilize Damascus and the areas around Damascus, or destabilization of Jordan, or split within Syrian Assad army. I mean, there is no doubt Assad is authoritarian, but destabilizing the areas ruled by Assad, who is of course an authoritarian, may transform the other parts of Syria as a nesting area of these sub-state actors, but not all of them are not all of them are terrorists. Because when I refer to sub-state actors, please be reminded, I'm not only referring terrorist groups. There are many legitimate sub-state actors. For example, in West Iraq, there is a big Dulaimi tribe, which is a tribe, but very peaceful, I mean, with no terrorist links, but the only way to protect their followers is that tribal networks. Now, this is the general picture from my scholarly perspective to understand what's happening in the region in terms of state structures. One secondary issue is, maybe you can imagine that, of course, if I'm talking about collapse of states, the collapse of borders. There's a kind of large area which start from Pakistan, end up Turkish-Syrian border, a large area with almost with no border control. Maybe this is America. I mean, in US, your standards are bigger than us, but in the Middle East, 900 kilometers is a very, very long border. Turkey's border with Syria is 910 or something like that, 10 kilometers, which means that for a typical Middle Eastern state, it requires billions of dollars to invest, which is not possible, or thousands of manpower. In Middle East, to protect such a long border, you need a mutual understanding with a regime on the other side of the border, which does not exist right now. There is no government on the other side of Turkish-Syrian border. On the east, we have Peshmerga reporting to Barzani in Iraq. On the middle, we have another Kurdish group, which is close to Turkish Kurds. On the east of that borderline, we have so many other groups, including Al-Qaeda-linked organizations. So this means that one part of globe has become a large area with no border control. This is extremely important to analyze, again, these sub-state actors, because they can move easily, they can mobilize their followers from one point to another point very, very quickly. Now, based on that, let me now focus on these groups. Who are they, what are they, how they act. But before doing that, let me clarify a point. While I'm referring to many groups, you shouldn't think that all the Middle East are ruled by these groups. When we start talking about the groups, ISIS, Ahrar al-Sham, Liwa al-Tawhid, PYD, PG, people automatically think that Middle East is, invaded all these groups. I mean, some of these groups are very small groups. For example, Liwa al-Tawhid, which is part of Islamic Front, a religious group, has something between 2,000 and 3,000 members, which means that while talking intensively about these groups and their logic, I don't want to give the false impression that the whole region is ruled by these groups. So many groups we have. For example, we are all familiar with ISIS, but there's another Hazm group, the Nusra Jabha, Jabhatun Nusra, Nusra Front, or I mentioned Islamic Front. Islamic Front is a coalition which is composed of two different groups, Liwa al-Tawhid, Ahrar al-Sham. The Kurds have their groups, Peshmerga reporting to Barzani, other Kurds, PYG, PYD, and so on and so forth. There are many groups produced because of these things. Out of state collapse, before the details, there is another issue. Why so many groups quickly become very effective in that region? Ladies and gentlemen, Syria has never produced a military uprising in its modern history. For example, if I was talking about Lebanon or Lebanese history, I would refer Hezbollah. We're all familiar with Hezbollah. It's a military organization. They have power. If I was talking about Turkish history, I would refer PKK. PKK is a Kurdish organization with a military wing, just like IRA and Sinn Féin. And the whole history of modern Syria, there was no such a military protest culture. Syria was authoritarian but peaceful in that sense. As I said, I had the opportunity of spending some time in Syria. Interestingly, there was no positive freedom, which means that there was no right to criticize government, there was no right to create a union or create a party, no elections, but there were negative freedoms, which means that if you are a Christian, you can open a church, you can wear whatever you want, so on and so forth. But the problem, good point about the former Syria was, Syria has never produced a violent-based opposition. This is extremely important for us to analyze the current situation in Syria. When revolutionary process started in Syria, because there was no experience, you cannot expect ordinary people who have never been part of such violence become, hardliner fighters against Assad. That gap was quickly fulfilled by foreign fighters. So another reason to explain this quick emergence of groups, the lack of such a tradition in Syria. So most of them came out of Syria. Before the groups, these groups depend on three dynamics. The first is networking capacity. By networking capacity, I refer that there is a global network that can be used in peaceful and negative way. For example, a Palestinian-born Abdullah Azzam went to Afghanistan in late 70s, and he formulated Afghan jihadi ideology in late 70s, during the Cold War era. If you go back to Western media, newspapers, or Middle East newspapers, there were many good stories about Abdullah Azzam, because he was challenging Soviet imperialism over there. He was a great guy, so on and so forth. But he had an infamous student, which came out later, Bin Laden. Then things dramatically changed about Abdullah Azzam. But this is interesting because he was a Palestinian who formulated a jihad ideology in Afghanistan, which shows this networking capacity. So it is not something new, happened recently. That network of jihadi ideology traced back to late 70s and 80s and 90s. For example, right now, the US government is talking about supporting some opposition groups. It sounds funny and reasonable. It happened in this way in late 70s. So some of the groups that we are going to support may change their ideas. So the same logic did prevail in late 70s. Of course we cannot, of course we should support the opposing groups against Soviet Russia. So this is more or less the same logic. The second is mobilization capacity of these groups, which means that they brought people from one country to another country. Let me give you interesting facts. Recently, ISIS appointed Abdus Salam al-Urduni, as you can imagine from his later name. He is from Jordan, al-Urduni, from Jordan, as the Emir of Lebanon. Because ISIS thinks that he is responsible of global affairs, and the headquarters of ISIS is appointing governors to different countries. So most of Lebanese people have no idea about that, but they have an appointed emir by ISIS. But this is telling because a Jordanian was appointed by ISIS as an emir to Lebanese. It gives that transnational ideology. The second is the former leader of Iraqi al-Qaeda was also Jordanian. He was killed, replaced by al-Masri. As you can guess from his name, al-Masri, he's from Egypt. So this is interesting because this mobilization capacity, bringing people from one country to another country, how it happens? In the post-Cold War period of history of sub-state actors, recruitment depends on two pillars. One is ideology. To persuade people, you need an ideology. Most of the ISIS leaders have a very good education. For example, the Khalif, the leader of ISIS, has a PhD degree from University of Baghdad. So, they have the intellectual capacity to speculate about the sociological dynamics of global system and state-society relations. The second is money, financing. That is why when you follow the news about ISIS in the last 3 weeks, the agreement between US and 10 Arab states, there's a special focus on oil smuggling, because recruitment is a very expensive process. You recruit someone from Europe, you need money to bring him to Iraq, and also you should care about his or her family. People should be satisfied about the people they left behind them. So it's all also about money. So recruitment depends on one, ideological persuasion. The second is financial capacity. If you don't have money, you cannot recruit many people. And compared with other groups, ISIS is doing well because they got the control of some oil refineries in Iraq. And they are very using somehow, comparatively speaking, sophisticated methods of oil smuggling. So if you don't have money, which means that you're going to lose your market in recruitment field. This refers to mobilization capacity. The third point is pragmatism. The emergence of ISIS itself is a brilliant sample of pragmatism. Let me summarize that. In the beginning, there was the Iraqi Al-Qaeda state of Iraq and Levant, Rafidain, which means two rivers, Mesopotamia, the Tigris and other river. Part of that, there was Jebha Nusra front. The funny thing, maybe the dramatic thing, is some regional countries and some Western countries thought that Nusra front was the correct choice to support against Assad. Because I'm talking about radical groups, but there is also secular opposition, Free Syrian Army, the new command structure, which was supported by Saudi intelligence. I don't want to make it a kind of mess, but so many groups we have over there, secular, religious and so forth. But in the beginning, I don't want to name their names, but some Gulf countries and some other countries thought that it is better to support Nusra group to weaken Assad. But then ISIS declared its autonomy from Nusra group. For some reasons, I don't want to bring all details here, some economy-based, some faith-based debates. Then Nusra brought the issue to Al-Qaeda headquarters and said there's a problem between us. Al-Qaeda headquarters decided that ISIS was wrong. Then ISIS declared that they are not recognizing Al-Qaeda's decision on that. And they proclaimed their own Khalif Baghdadi. Proclaiming a caliphate, appointing a caliph means that I am the absolute authority. I no longer accept your authority over me. This is important because it could be good to hear that the relationship between Al-Qaeda and ISIS is not well. It may stop ISIS using Al-Qaeda's some of global networks. Because when ISIS declared its total independence from Al-Qaeda, most of the Jebha Nusra members split from Nusra and became part of ISIS. Then the all weapon and financial support that were given previously to Nusra became automatically possession of ISIS. So while talking about supporting some groups, we should imagine again that this may happen. These are very pragmatic and very flexible organizations. But the lack of strong connection, because according to Al-Qaeda, ISIS is a kind of heretic organization which does not accept the global ecumenic authority of its headquarters. But this shift of power between ISIS and Nusra and Al-Qaeda shows that these are very, very pragmatic. Even last summer, when ISIS attacked Aleppo, there was a coalition to stop ISIS, and Nusra, some part of Nusra had that coalition to stop ISIS. Actually, they were former friends. And some interesting point, when the case brought to Al-Qaeda headquarters said that there is another small group, Ahrar sham which is to arbitrate between ISIS and Nusra. Then Ahrar sham became also enemy of ISIS. Which means that they are very pragmatic, they change their positions, which is good and bad. It is good, you can manipulate them, which is bad in the long term, they can change suddenly their position on this issue. Let me give you another sample of pragmatism. When ISIS attacked Lebanese border, Hezbollah, the religious group, start employing Christians in a special unit to stop ISIS. Because facing such a threat, the only way is to find some people among Christian community to keep unity. That's a very ultra level of pragmatism, something we should appreciate. Sheikh Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, now proposing an alternative strategy even to include Christians. So facing ISIS, these groups are acting very, very pragmatic way. Another case, for example, normally, historically, the relationship between Yazidi people, there's a small group of Yazidi. It is very difficult to categorize them as Muslim or not. They are a kind of, they are the continuing forms of very old pre-Islamic and mixture of Islamic traditions, including Yazidi. But facing ISIS threat, Yazidi groups and Kurdish groups cooperated, make a kind of alliance to stop that. So this shows that these groups have a capacity to redefine very quickly their ideological positions. This is particularly important to evaluate Western US-led coalition policy towards Syria. Because on the ground, there is no enemy. You cannot send troops. The only way is to contain from air. But on the ground, if you want to proceed, you should find someone to help you. But this is risky, because the groups you specify to support may change their positions tomorrow. No one can guarantee that in the long term. So this shows how it is difficult from that perspective. In the beginning of my speech, I said that a major lesson of the Arab Spring is not to destabilize region or any part of the region if you don't have a very quick alternative or capacity to make a quick change in the area. In this case, the ISIS threat creates serious opportunity to include Iran into the game. Because I have talked about many names of countries, Libya collapse, Syria collapse. So the last thing that may happen to the region is destabilization of Jordan, destabilization of Iran. And Iran, frankly speaking, doing very well. You know, they changed their president. In the past, there was Ahmadinejad. In my opinion, Ahmadinejad, I'm not sure if I can use this word, but, you know, quote unquote, he was a distortion of Iranian revolutionary line. Even though he was known globally as an ardent defender of Islamic revolution, I met many people who is now working for Rouhani administration. They were all critical of Ahmadinejad. So we have a guy, a new president in Iran, Rouhani, who served in many security institutions of Iran, also student of Ayatollah Gulpayani, who inspired Khomeini in 60s and 70s. So Rouhani is a person who has the legitimacy card at home. If Rouhani says yes to something, it means that Rouhani has a capacity to persuade spiritual establishment in Iran. So it could be also alternative opportunity to include Iran, because from the very beginning, Syria is a strategic issue for Iran. In Iran, if something is strategic, it is directly controlled by, led by spiritual leaders. You know, in Iran, there is the secular elected president, the popular elected president, but also there is a religious leader. But strategic issues are directly part of spiritual leaders' agenda. So Syria is a strategic issue for Iran. They will never change their main position. So even the international community should think cooperating with Iran on the Syrian issue. In the early days of Syrian crisis, I met an Iranian scholar who told me that Iran is going to defend Damascus as they defend Tehran. And I should remind you that when Iranian revolution took place in 1979, it was Syria or Soviet Russia first recognized that Islamic regime. So they have a very complex relationship in the history. So for them, it is very, very difficult to change these fixed points in somewhere in the history. And that is why Iran has sent many, many people to support and train pro-Assad people on the ground. But facing this chaotic situation, we shouldn't underestimate the role of even local countries, including Iran. Okay, now, before finalizing my words, I have a question. As a scholar coming from a Muslim country, why we have these problems? I mean, people wonder that, this is a difficult question. First of all, as I said, we shouldn't think that all Muslim societies are ruled by these extremists. Albania is peaceful, Bosnia is peaceful, Malaysia is peaceful. There's a corruption in Latin America. The second is, there is a room to blame West on that, because we didn't destroy the state structure in Iraq. But, on the other hand, frankly speaking, I think it is time for larger Muslim community to pave the way for a kind of reformist interpretation of Islam. But it is very difficult, because religious texts do not speak. Bible doesn't speak, I don't know, Quran doesn't speak. It is interpreted by people. And important is not Quran, but how it is interpreted. So having such a collapsed series of societies, from Pakistan to Iraq, you cannot expect a let's say, a different interpretation. That is the social conditions, lacking education. In Afghanistan, I met several ladies and asked them why they are wearing burqa. You know what is burqa? I thought they were wearing that mainly because of religion. No, to protect themselves. There is no order. I mean, in Afghanistan, in some places of Afghanistan. So, the problem of how we interpret Islam is mainly about society, conditions, politics, social conditions, education, so on and so forth. But on the other hand, there are dynamic larger Muslim community who are trying to stop this negative image of Islam produced by ISIS. I have a personal anecdote. Before leaving Istanbul, a couple of weeks ago, before this meeting, I met a businessman whom I never met. He heard about me and said that, Professor, I know you are frequently traveling different countries. I have money. I want to print some pamphlets saying that Islam is not ISIS. Can you distribute to the places where you are going? So people are very unhappy about that ISIS. And hopefully we are receiving some clerics condemning ISIS. But we shouldn't forget that we have millions of people lacking major, prerequisites of social order, no school, no security, and how they interpret Islam or how the clergy in those interpret Islam are very much linked to these very, very negative conditions. But despite accepting that, as a scholar coming from Muslim background, there is a galvanizing reaction from the larger Muslim population calling for a new interpretation of Islam, which strictly condemns ISIS-like facts. But even small things are important. For example, a couple of weeks ago, the former advisor Brzezinski, speaking on CNN, said that we shouldn't say Islamic State. It is neither Islamic nor state. And I'm glad to hear it was repeated by Obama's official declaration. Even it makes sense. The larger Muslim community are happy to hear that, okay, people are not calling the Islamic State because it's not Islamic, it's not state. It's a sophisticatedly organized terrorist organization, terrorist group. So we shouldn't call it as a state, we shouldn't call it as Islam. But this small linguistic gesture even changed the mindset or psychological mindset in the larger Muslim community. So on the one hand, as a professor of international politics, I think there is a room that we should blame foreign intervention to explain why we have these groups. But on the other hand, speaking from inner circles of Islam, dynamic inner parts of Islam, I accept Muslim community should struggle for a new interpretation of Islam, which is democracy-friendly, human rights, studies of women, so on and so forth. But finally, I also should say that there is an ongoing intra-Islamic competition in Muslim countries. Muslims are not homogeneous, so while talking about the West and Islam, this grand debate, we shouldn't ignore that there is an ongoing intra-Islamic debate. Which Islam? Which kind of interpretation? So that is, I think, the critical dynamic to determine long-term studies in the whole Islamic world. Thank you very much for listening to me. I will be happy to hear your questions and comments.
We have time for a few questions, so if you would raise your hands, and then we'll get the microphone to you. Yes, right here.
Thank you. I'm an Australian visitor, and recently we went to Turkey for about 3 or 4 weeks with my husband here, and I found it an absolute privilege. I didn't know much about the Muslim religion, and we learned a lot about, we went into mosques, and we learned a great deal about how Turkish people live. And I was very sad to leave the country. I felt that you have a great community spirit there. When we came home, all of these troubles started, and I thought, isn't it a shame that all the people who are good Muslims get a bad name from a group like ISIS? Then yesterday, I discovered my hometown of Sydney had a terrible terrorist warning there was going to be some attack in the city, and that made me really sad, because we've tried to welcome Muslims into our community in Australia. We have a number of mosques there, and we've tried our best to welcome them. But then when you get this ISIS problem, it makes everybody very scared. I was wondering about your comments about dealing with the fear of ISIS.
I agree. I mean, but there's a saying in Arabic, "At-tahrib ashal," which means that destruction is easy. So it is normal that people are much influenced by unwanted developments, and I'm not criticizing Western community because of they are alarmed by ISIS. Of course, it is affecting people and their life. Nobody wants to see someone linked to ISIS as a neighbor. But as I said, one, ISIS doesn't have the capacity to represent sociologically the whole Muslim countries. I've been part of many Fridays sermons in the last 6 or 7 months. Most of the imams in Turkey, whatever they are talking about, they give a special attention to ISIS threat, warning society because of their kids. People should be insane to be in favor of that groups. And I don't want to summarize it here, but there's a huge literature about that, how people becoming part of that. People are blowing themselves, each other, so on and so forth. The second point is, maybe it's not a scholarly answer, but the only way is to push, even though we are facing such challenges. I mean, the only way is to keep Australian tradition of being tolerant to foreigners. When I was a graduate student, I was in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam at that time was the city of tolerance, but after 20 years, the rise of center-right in Netherlands, and I don't think Amsterdam right now representing such a level of high tolerance. So communities, no matter Western or Eastern, shouldn't stop that tradition of tolerance facing ISIS-like threats, because that is the major strategy of ISIS, creating a kind of hopelessness among, between people, so on and so forth. So I don't know there's a scholarly answer to that, but my personal humble suggestion, advice is to keep good contact with your Muslim neighbors.
Okay. Question? Yes, here's a question right over here.
We began in our country hearing about ISIS, which was Syria, then ISIL, which is the entire Levant. Can you give us an idea of their vision of a caliphate? How large
What
or
area? Yeah.
of a caliphate? What would that entail?
Okay. ISIS means Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIL comes Iraq and Levant. But they prefer to be called Islamic State. The Arabic version is Daesh, is the first letters of Arabic translation of ISIS. Right now, there is a misunderstanding of that. On the one hand, they control large area, okay? But if you are familiar with Syrian geography, in the south east part of Syria, or northeast part of Syria, there's a large province, Deir ez-Zor, which is maybe like Arkansas. It's 1/3 of Turkey, but just there's only 3 million living in this state. So it's a big area, big state, but with less people. So there are no state controls, no patrols. So they are, for them, very easy to move one city to another, which give a false impression of ISIS has a large areas. Because I read an article from a British media saying that ISIS controls a territory which is as big as Portugal, which is correct, but not true. Because this is a huge area. I mean, you can control a large area in any country, but because people are not interested in the geography. The problem is ISIS is focusing on small towns, small areas, strategically important to that. But the first point is there are many groups, local groups and other groups, trying to stop ISIS, and hopefully we have an international coalition planning some strategies to stop ISIS. So some cities, I can list their names, but at this point, as I told Professor Dean before this meeting, it is not correct to underestimate ISIS right now, but it is not correct to exaggerate it. For example, I have been in US, it's been 6 days, and I'm a little bit surprised to see, I'm opening US Today, it's about ISIS, listening National Public Radio, ISIS, and even it's not the case in Turkey. I mean, so it's a little bit surprising to me. There's a kind of social interest. So, I mean, many people are talking and asking about ISIS. So it's a threat, but it's not ruling a large area. Ideologically, they believe that they are the global caliphate. But this is the plan. I mean, there are some funny interview with some ISIS members talking about conquering Rome, so on and so forth. So I think it is still early, ma'am, to speculate about ISIS' capacity to control the region. It is still early. It depends on how the coalition is going to interact with this problem, how local people will react in that problem. And not all people are happy of ISIS government. It's a fear. I mean, so many people are depressed by ISIS, but they have no other option to stay at home because ISIS is a brutal organization. It doesn't mean that the cities ruled by ISIS are full of happy people praising ISIS. It's not the case.
Yes, sir, right here. Okay, you got the microphone. She's bringing it to you.
I want to thank you for your insights. It's been most informative. I want to go back to the last part of your speech where you were talking about some movement within Islam, that not everybody is one way or the other. And you alluded to the fact that maybe this was part of the long-term solution, that people within the Islamic faith would rise up, or I'm probably misstating it. How do you see that happening specifically?
This requires a very philosophical answer, fortunately or unfortunately, if I may do it in a philosophical way. Imagine 1940s Europe. You know, Germans and Brits are killing each other just 50 years ago. We were out of Second Great War. I mean, a person living in mid-40s was probably in Turkey watching and saying, why these Europeans are killing each other in such a way? So it sometimes happened to civilizations, okay? It happens. Or imagine 1500s Europe, 1600s Europe, the sectarian wars, 1940. So this is part, I don't want to make it as a fatalistic, but sometimes civilization faced structural crisis. In my perspective, this is a crisis of inner dynamics of Islam. It's about colonialism. It's about collapse of this or that. But the basic point I want to emphasize is that Islamic people are not homogeneous. Okay, there are different groups, and that is why I call it intra-Islamic competition. There are some hardliners. Okay, there are some liberal guys. Who are, also like us, alarmed by ISIS-like threats. But there is no shortcut solution. I mean, the origins of these problems trace back to early years of colonialism, medieval ages. The link between Islam and rationality is now weak. There is a lack of self-criticism, strong governments, rentier structure, for example, in Kuwait, in Qatar. Do you know per capita income in Qatar is $96,000? Which means that you don't need to pay, you don't need to criticize, because government, I mean, just being a Qatari citizen, it means that that is why I think it's more difficult to be a Qatari citizen than the American citizen, because being a Qatari citizen is automatically that is a big great opportunity. So in such a rentier structure, state is buying their citizens' loyalty, okay, in a rentier. So there are many reasons, but on the other hand, there is a distinguished American comparativist, Alfred Stephan, who did write a fascinating article and say that this is not an Islamic problem. I don't want to offend, but it is more about Arab regions, okay? So we should make this distinction. The lack of such a strong democratic tradition, how to understand West? What do you mean by West? Is it US, is it Norway, or Latin America? I mean, there's authoritarian tendency in Latin America, Christian societies. So just like Christianity, there are different regions in Islam. And for example, Indonesia, in terms of democratic standards, are far better than many Middle Eastern countries. Free elections, some kind of freedom of even limited press, so on and so forth. But there is a there are spatial dynamics about Arab region. So that is why some scholars, such as Professor Stephan, analyzing that rather than Islamic, a more Arab phenomenon, okay, causing that. So. But I'm very optimistic, as I said, this intra-Islamic debate, I hope, is likely to bring larger Islamic community to a new understanding, which call for a democratic, gender equality-based understanding of Islam. But it requires time, from the European history. I mean, I was in Alamo, was that? So the story of US, so many dramatic things happened in the past, but it didn't happen very quickly. It takes then years and years.